Well, tough times. You can lose the bells from the monastery, or you can lose your livelihood. So what would happen if a woman who had 3 teenage sons lost her husband and their father at sea? How would she ever supply as much food as those boys would need for their appetites? If you have ever had teenage sons, or if you have ever been a teenage son or known any teenage sons, you can imagine how difficult that might be. Well, here is a story that comes from Scotland. It is a story about a woman named Mallie. Now, her husband had been lost at sea, but she was not alone because she had 3 sons. 3 sons who were almost men. And as you can imagine, it was difficult for her to keep enough food on the table to satisfy their appetites. Well, she did what she could. And so when winter was approaching, she got as many supplies as she could manage. She got a large barrel of herring and another large barrel of meal and a large sack of potatoes. But the winter lasted longer than the food. And so one day, when they had eaten the last of the potatoes and the last of the meal and the last of the herrings, she told her sons that there was no more food. They looked at her and they looked at each other and they said, "What will we do?" And she said, "We will do what we must. We will ask for help." And so the next morning, the oldest son went to their nearest neighbor, an old woman who seemed to always have plenty of resources. He knocked on the door. She answered, and he could see behind her shelves and shelves with meat and vegetables and bread and all kinds of food. She said, "Why are you here? What do you want?" And he said, "We have no food. Can you share?" And she looked at him with a frown and said, "I can't believe you would come here begging. Be gone and don't come back." And she slammed the door in his face. Well, although that boy was almost a man, when he returned home, there were tears streaming down his cheeks. "Oh, Mother," he said to Mallie, "she was so angry. She was so mean." And Mallie looked at her son and said, "Some people are like that, son, but we are not." Well, later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. And when Mallie answered, there was a man standing there, an old man with a long white beard and dressed in ragged clothes. And he said, "I have been walking for 2 days, and I am tired, and I am cold, and I am hungry. Can you help me?" "Well," said Mallie, "we have no food, but you are welcome to come in and sit beside the fire and get warm." And so the man came in and he sat down before the fire, warming his hands and feet. Mallie began to think maybe there was just a little something. So she went to the barrel where there had been herring. There were no herring in there. There was a little bit of brine. And then she went to the barrel where there had been the meal. And she took a soft brush and she brushed in the corners and crevices and in the lid. And finally, she had a small pile of meal. So she mixed the meal with the brine and she divided it into 5 portions, though the truth was she took very little for herself. And that was their supper. It wasn't good, but it was food. And they were grateful to have it. Well, Mallie invited the man, the stranger, to spend the night there at her house. She said, "We don't have an extra bed, but we have an extra blanket and you can sleep here by the fire and be warm." And he gratefully accepted. The next morning, one of the boys went out to a well to get water, and they each had a cup of water, and that was their breakfast. And the stranger got himself ready to leave, but he paused at the threshold and turned back and spoke to Mallie. He said, "Was that truly all the food that you had?" "It was," she said, "and now we have not a crumb." He said to her, "Bless you, woman, for your kindness to a stranger." And then he left. Well, Mallie and the boys, they looked at each other rather sadly, for there was still no food in the house. And Mallie said, "Well, at least we can be warm." And so one of the sons went out to the peat pile and got a load of peats, brought it in. And Mallie picked up one of the peats. It was rather large. And so she broke it in half. And when she did, something fell to the ground. They looked, and it was a gold coin. She picked up another peat and broke it in half. Another gold coin. So many peats, so many gold coins. She gathered up those coins and she took them to the market, and she bought all the food that they needed or wanted, things they hadn't seen for months. And of course, with so much food, Mallie shared with the neighbors. Well, the word got around. And so the neighbor woman who had been so unkind, she heard that somehow Mallie had food and had means to buy that food. How is that possible? Under cover of darkness one night, she sneaked over to Mallie's house and peered in the window. And she saw when Mallie picked up peats and broke them in two, and gold fell out of the peats. Said the woman to herself, "I could do that." So she went to the peat pile by Mallie's house, and she carried away as many peats as she could. She went back to her house, and she sat down in her chair, put the peats down, and prepared to be rich. She picked up one of the peats, she broke it in half, and something fell out. It wasn't a gold coin. It was, in fact, two mice that scurried off into her house. Well, she picked up another peat, broke it in half. Two more mice. More peats, more mice, more peats, more mice, more peats, more mice, until they overran the house. They got into the larder, and they devoured every crumb of food. Well, the woman waited for 3 days, and then she made her way to Mallie's house. She knocked on the door, and who should answer the door but the same young man that she had turned away from her house the week before. I have no food," she said. "Do you have some to share?" And the boy looked at her long and said, "Of course, I would be happy to share with you just as much as you shared with us when I came to your door." And he slammed the door. Well, Mallie heard the door slam, and she said to her son, "Who was that, son?" He said, "Oh, mother, it was the neighbor woman, the one who turned me away last week when we needed food." "Oh, son," she said, "I know that you remember that, but I hope that you also remember what I told you. Some people are like that, but we are not. Open the door, son." And so he did. And Mallie welcomed the woman into her home. And she said, "As long as we have food, you will not go hungry." And so it was that time passed. And those boys grew to be men, fine citizens, fine fathers, good husbands. But the people of that town always said that there never were any men who were kinder, more generous, and more compassionate than Mallie's sons. And that is the story of Mallie and the Trow, for they recognized that the stranger who had come to their house was no ordinary man, but rather one of the folk that could grant blessings.